Yuzu! Yuzu! The voice sounded so far away. She wasn't where she was supposed to be. Actually, she wasn't sure where she was at all. Yuzu opened her eyes. Her lips parted as she took in the world around her. This wasn't the tree she had fallen asleep in. It also wasn't anything at all like her home, Rayglen. Where Rayglen was small, surrounded by trees that filtered in sunlight to dapple across beautiful, elegant buildings, this place was huge. She could see all the way to the stain of mountains in the horizon, not a single tree in sight no matter which direction she looked. The ground had turned gray as though something had bleached all the life and color from it. The dirt cracked, dry, and pockmarked under her feet. Shards of earth jutted out into the sky, as though some great force had caused it to bubble up from underground and explode. Debris littered the ground in between the ripples of cracked soil. Her stomach twisted. It wasn't just dry earth littering the ground. There were bodies here, too. All at once, they seemed to become visible to her. Human bodies, still and as gray as the soil beneath them, were scattered across the ground, draped over jutting walls of clay and thrown at awkward positions. Some of them were in pieces. Yuzu clapped her hands over her mouth, bile rising at the back of her throat. Their armor was twisted and melted, swords shattered in flakes of steel that glittered dully under the low, heavy gray sky. She couldn't breathe. The stench of death was too strong, although it seemed the blood had dried away long ago, leaving the world to a horrible, silent gray. Yuzu took a step back from the horrible vision surrounding her. Why was she here? What had happened? She choked on a scream when her heel caught on something behind her. Not earth, something fleshy. Oh, goddess. She stumbled forward from the body she had almost stepped on. Her head spun. What happened? Where was she? What was going on? What do you think? The voice was so quiet that she almost thought it was her own mind, but in the silence of the worn battlefield it seemed to echo. She tried to turn around, but hands wrapped around her from behind, hugging her against something warm and alive. She screamed, trying to struggle free. The arms held firm despite her wriggling. She couldn't get loose, couldn't turn her head to see who held her. The question rang in Yuzu's mind. What did she think? It's awful, she choked out. This is terrible. The person holding her didn't speak for a moment. Only their breath ghosted against Yuzu's shoulder. Then they laughed. A soft, broken, tear-filled sound. You're right, they murmured. It's terrible. One hand cupped against Yuzu's cheek, and for a moment, Yuzu thought she would turn her head around, see the person behind her. Please don't let it happen again. Yuzu! Yuzu gasped, her eyes flying open. All at once, her center of gravity shifted and she yelped, arms wheeling as the bulk of the branch underneath her slipped away, or rather, she slipped off. Oof! She dropped and smacked into something solid and fleshy, both of them hitting the ground heavily. Yuzu's head spun for a moment. All she could do was lay there and stare up into the leaves and pink blossoms above her with the sun filtering between them. The cherries are blooming, she thought dazedly. It's not the season for that. Ugh! This is why we don't sleep in trees! Get off! Yuzu scrambled up to a sitting position, turning sheepishly to face Selena. Sorry, she said, grimacing. The other girl glowered at Yuzu as she sat up, rubbing the back of her head. Her ponytail was coming a bit loose from the fall, strands of azure dipping down her face. She reached back to retie her yellow ribbon, green eyes sparkling with irritation. She was a stringy girl, all bones and wiry muscles, her fair skin tanned and slightly freckled from too much time spent in the sun training every day. You know, we might have a training break, but that doesn't mean go hide and take a nap, Selena said. I wasn't planning on napping, Yuzu said, although that was only half true. How did you find me? She thought she had picked a good hiding nook, nestled up in the crook of a tree inside a large copse of them, hidden from view. Selena just raised an eyebrow at her. She jerked one finger up towards the canopy, and Yuzu's eyes lifted. Her cheeks flushed. That's right, it wasn't the season for cherry blossoms. In the copse of trees, only the one that Yuzu had fallen asleep in was blooming. The others were simply a summer's green. Selena dusted her knees off as she stood. You know, if you don't want to be found, you should stop making flowers bloom in your sleep. I'm not trying to, Yuzu mumbled. She took the hand that Selena offered her, helping her get to her feet. She ran her fingers through her hair then, frowning to realize that her pigtails were coming undone. She released one tie so that she could regather the magenta hair, her pale hands reflecting the dappled light from the trees above. It's not my fault that my blessing just happens sometimes. Selena didn't respond, one end of her lips quirking downward, and Yuzu quieted. Selena might try to hide it, but it bothered her when the others talked about their blessings. Yuzu knew Selena was a little touchy about hers, or rather her uncertainty if she had one at all. Not that Yuzu's was any better. Her blessing was making flowers bloom. What was so useful about that? Although a good chunk of students at Raglan didn't even have blessings at all. Blessings were, however, the prerequisite to join the champion-elect. For years, Raglan had remained a sanctuary for the followers of the goddess, the one who had mothered life and created humanity. Even as the world outside the sanctuary grew cold and dark, here light would remain. The demon and its legion continued to grow, but here the Raglan monks and nuns continued to find those with goddess blessings, abilities born into select humans. Only those with blessings had the chance to manifest the goddess sword and become the champion. Yuzu was determined to be that champion. So, what did you need? Yuzu said, fixing her other pigtail. Or did I miss coming back to training on time again? Selena's face suddenly grew a little paler, her eyes twitching downward. The brothers and sisters are calling us. I think something's wrong. Yuzu's heart leaped. Her dream flashed through her mind again, that horrible barren wasteland littered with bodies. Wrong? What was wrong? Yuzu followed after Selena without another word, weaving through the woods to the cleared part of the village. The sunlight blinded her briefly as they stepped free of the trees, but she adjusted quickly. The smooth green grass, a little taller than her ankles, rustled in the breeze beneath them until they reached the path. It was a simple construction of pounded-down dirt, a little rutted from the wagons that passed through occasionally, but there was never very much traffic around here. It was around noon, so the houses were mostly quiet. People were probably already at work at the university or out in the gardens with their packed lunches. Nothing was much more advanced than packed earth and thatched roofs, not like the more complex wood and stone houses in the town just outside the woods, where Yuzu was sometimes sent to run errands. At the end of the path, the university stood taller than the rest of the village. It was the tallest building in both this and the next town, almost grazing up above the tree cover with its tall spires. It was a pale color, as though made out of birch trees, with twisted, sometimes asymmetrical pillars and buttresses that made it look as though it had been grown out of the earth and made of trees twisted together. Stained glass windows in soft, gentle colors were inset into the walls so that the light could filter through inside. Selena led Yuzu away from the university's main doors, though, and around to the convent built into the side. The doors were much smaller and darker, hewn from wood and carved with elegant vines. She held the door open for Yuzu, who slipped inside. The front section of the convent opened directly into the main chapel. The ceiling rose gently to a soft, arched point, paintings of the sky and tree canopies overhead, as though there were no ceiling at all. The light filtered through the stained glass in faint streams of pastel, sending the quiet, otherwise empty space into a dreamlike state. The other champion-elect were already present, milling about softly and whispering among themselves, eyes flickering to the shrine at the very back. It was a simple little house design with a grill in front of the only window. Inside would be the offerings to the goddess, to persuade her to come into the house and bless them with her presence. Yuzu had never sensed anything from inside. She wasn't sure if that meant anything. A girl looked up when the door closed with a soft click, and she waved quickly to Yuzu and Selena, beckoning them to come over. "What's going on?" Yuzu asked as she approached. Ruri shook her head, brows furrowed with the same confusion that Yuzu felt. Ruri was always the elegant one in their group. She didn't seem to even have to try to look like she was a princess. She stood easily, her hands clasped in front of her, shoulders back and head held high. It was like the regality was an inherent part of her, as her light brown skin, her magenta eyes, and her elegant dark violet hair twisted into a perfect ponytail bun behind her. "They haven't told us anything," Rin said, popping up before Ruri could speak. Where Ruri was elegant, Rin seemed built more for forges and smithies. She was a little shorter than the rest of them. Although she had the same eerily similar facial features to Ruri, Selena, and Yuzu herself, everything about her seemed a little stouter and fuller, putting on significant muscle more easily than the other three. She had cut her pale green hair herself despite protests from the monks and nuns, and it floofed about her face unevenly. Bangs cut at an angle over her sharp green eyes in a freckled, fair-skinned face. "Nothing," Yuzu said. "They called everyone here for no reason?" "I'm sure there's a reason, we just haven't had a chance to hear it yet," Ruri said. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, but then almost immediately pulled it back to twist it around a finger. Yuzu grimaced, looking around at the other champion-elect. Everyone seemed a little nervous. There was a buzz around them that was getting Yuzu all worked up. Her eyes flickered around the room as she chewed on her lip, marking off in her head everyone who was there. There weren't a lot of champion-elect, only about 25 or so. She knew everyone to some degree, but there were cliques and friend groups just like anywhere else. She herself tended to stick with Selena and the others. She noted Hokuto and Yaiba off in a corner whispering between themselves, two of the small handful of male champion-elect. "Oh, Masumi wasn't here yet?" The door opened again, and another girl slipped through. No, there she was. The dark-skinned girl's crimson eyes flickered briefly over the room, catching on Yuzu's gaze for a minute. She nodded, raven hair swishing, but she didn't have much time to do more than that before a soft bell rang through the room, and all eyes returned to the shrine on the raised dais. The girl who had rung the bell, Mieru, placed it down on a pillow to silence it as soon as the room grew quiet. Her fluffy, curly orange hair bounced against her gray robes as she bowed briefly to the room. Her eyes moved to the door. After a beat, it opened, and the abbess appeared. Himika was a tall, imposing woman, her red hair pulled back from a pale face into a tight, severe bun. She was the only one in the pure white robes, with blue embroidery along the ribbon stole. Her sharp eyes glanced out across the room, silencing whispers before they began. She came to a stop beside Mieru. The girl simply stood there for a moment, before Himika waved in nearly imperceptibly at her, and Mieru stopped down to a lower step to wait. For a moment, there was only silence. "I will not take your time with frivolous openings," Himika said. Her voice rang through the room with a nerve-wracking snap. "I'm sure most of you are aware," she said, "that in eclipsing the capital of our enemy Zarkania, we have recently been supporting an insurrection against the Emperor." Yuzu's chest tightened. That had been the topic of the day for weeks. A rebellion right in the heart of the demon's empire. It was like something out of a ballad. She had spent nights dreaming about finally reaching the potential to create the goddess sword, taking it up and joining the rebellion there to finally strike the demon down. But was something wrong? Everyone looked so grave and nervous. "Last night, an effort was made to strike," Himika said, "against our recommendation." Ruri inhaled sharply. Rin swore under her breath. Selena's fists tightened. Yuzu's heart fluttered. No, they hadn't. "The head of the rebellion was executed this morning. We received the falcon just hours ago." Oh, goddess. Yuzu's hand gripped at her tunic above her heart, feeling the blood rush out of her face. Oh no, no, it hadn't. A large remnant of the force remains, but their recklessness has given us a hard choice. We have decided to withdraw support from the Eclipsing Rebellion. You can't! It was Masami's voice that blurted out the exclamation, and she ducked her head behind her bangs as all eyes suddenly turned towards her. Himika's lips tightened briefly. We do not have the excess resources to spare, Apprentice Kotsu, she said. Raglan has survived for this long through patience. We cannot afford a careless mistake. The rebellion made their mistake. We cannot stand with them for our own safety, for the preservation of the goddess. For the preservation of the goddess, Yuzu mumbled automatically along with the rest of the group, the call and response to ingrained. There will be an extra service held tonight in memory of those who fell, Himika said. You are encouraged, but not obligated to attend. She bowed her head briefly. The announcement is finished. Please return to your assigned training sessions for the afternoon. She swept away then, leaving through the same door she had arrived through. Mieru jumped, hurrying to grab the bell and pillow so that she could follow. For a brief moment, there was only silence. Then whispers exploded up all over the room, clumps forming around nervous exchanges and wringing hands. Yuzu turned towards the other girls, finding her own expression of unease mirrored in Ruri. All support? Ruri said, her hand over her heart. What about the healers we sent? Are we taking them back? Wouldn't they need them the most right now? They can't be serious, said Selena. We can't give up after just that. How are we supposed to beat him if we fall back at the slightest failure? The leader of the rebellion being executed isn't really a slight failure, Rin said, looking down. Her fists were tight and shaky, though, and Yuzu knew she was just as angry as Selena. Yuzu squeezed her hands together over her heart, biting her lip. So, what happens if someone gets the goddess sword now, she said. If we're withdrawing support, the rebellion won't support us either. How are we going to get a champion all the way to the capital, through the priests, and into the temple to fight the demon? The other three girls hesitated. It was clear that hadn't crossed their minds yet. We'll have to make contact ourselves. Masami's voice cut over them, making all four girls turn. The other girl stood tense, her arms folded over her chest. Yuzu hadn't heard her or the other two wander over, but Hokuto and Yaiba were here too. Hokuto shrugged when he caught Yuzu's eye, mouthing, Masami's getting feisty again, watch out for sparks. He flipped his dark purple bangs back over his constellation headpiece. What do you mean? Ruri asked. I mean that if the convent isn't going to help, we should, Masami said. We've been training since we were old enough to walk. Goddess sword or no goddess sword, we can do some damage. We should have been sent there from the start, Rin agreed, nodding furiously. We could have helped. We're still barely teenagers, Yuzu pointed out, but her stomach twisted. She had been thinking something similar. Among the rebellion, anyone found to have a blessing was usually secreted away to Raglan for training before the Zarkanian temple could claim them, which meant the rebellion was almost without blessings. That would have put them at a distinct disadvantage to the Zarkanian priests, who were armed not only with their own blessings, but with also the rumored, horrendous demon weapons created by the demon emperor himself. If Raglan isn't going to help them, we have to, Masami said. We're goddess-chosen, aren't we? We have to get out there and fight. How would we get out, though? Yaiba said. They keep an eye on us for a reason. Masami trembled a little, looking angry. Yuzu thought she was probably thinking about her father. Masami had never said it straight out, but Yuzu had guessed. Her father was still in the capital somewhere. Masami had arrived from there when she had displayed a blessing for manipulating gemstones, able to melt them into different shapes with only her thoughts. I don't know, but we can't just sit here practicing when there are real things out there that people like us are supposed to be fighting, she said. Why are we here if not to fight? Hokuto cleared his throat, and everyone glanced at him. He looked around briefly, as though to make sure no one else from the rest of the group was listening. Actually, he said, I think I might know a way out." "Really?" Yuzu said, eyes widening. "I've been paying attention to every time Airhead here tries to sneak out to go looking for her boyfriend," Hokuto said, jerking a thumb at Rin. Rin made an obscene gesture at him for the nickname, but she seemed as raptly attentive as the others. "I think I might know how the watches are rotated. They do them slightly irregularly so that we can't time it, but there's a pattern," Hokuto said. "The only thing we'd have to deal with is the barrier. Not sure how to disable that." The barrier was the only thing that kept them safe from the eyes of the demon. It made their home impossible to scry or teleport to with an enchantment scroll, and anyone who didn't know the precise entryway from the outside would simply get turned around and lost if they were approached. But from the inside, walking through into the forest would send up an alarm to the brothers and sisters that someone had exited without permission. Ruri said, narrowing her eyes in thought. "What if we set it off from another location first, to draw attention there?" "We'd have to leave someone behind then," Selena said, "to get caught." Ruri shook her head, a smile drawing over her lips. "No, we don't," she said. "The barrier won't set off if you send birds through it," Yaiba said. "They fly in and out all the time. It'd be a pain in the ass for the monks to check it out every time." "Maybe regular-sized birds," Ruri said. "But what about a rock?" The group all hesitated for a moment. There's a rock," Selena said, staring at Ruri. "Here?" "Wouldn't we have noticed?" Rin said. "I mean, a rock. They're like what? Bigger than horses, aren't they?" "About the size of elephants," Ruri said with a bright smile. "It's out just beyond the barrier. I sensed it setting up its nest in the deep woods." Ruri's blessing was way more useful than Yuzu's. She could talk to and command birds, making flying messages far more efficient, and even having falcons and eagles coming to her aid when she was in distress. Yuzu had almost lost an eye once when Ruri nearly fell down a drop-off, and a flock of crows had suddenly swarmed her while she was trying to pull her back up. "That would definitely set the barrier off," Yaiba said, nodding. He looked impressed. "Are we really doing this, though?" Ruri said, frowning. "I mean, they must have a reason for keeping us separate. Maybe we're wrong and we can't handle it yet." "No way," Selena said. "We're ready. We've been doing nothing but getting ready. And we won't be alone when we join the resistance, right?" "It's better than sitting on our asses," Rin said. "I'm in." Masami grinned triumphantly, turning her gaze to Hokuto. "How long do you think it will take you to figure out the pattern?" "Couple more days, maybe? A week at most," Hokuto said. "We should probably make some plans before then, like supplies and stuff." A bell rang insistently through the sanctuary, clamoring against the walls and making everyone jump and wince. "Right, lessons," Yuzu said. Let's talk more later." "Catch you during dinner," Selena said. Yuzu nodded, then she jumped over to join Masami and Ruri. They were all going the same way. Masami looked like she wanted to talk more, but her eyes slid over to the other champion-elect suspiciously, and she kept quiet. Yuzu just blinked out at the light when they left the sanctuary, squinting against the daylight. The dull gray landscape of her dream twisted at the back of her mind. "Do we really want to do this?" she thought, her stomach twisting.